Chapter 1 Blood Brothers. Gaston grew up in a picturesque kingdom. Its castle perched atop a towering rocky island that was connected to its lands by a long stone bridge. It was a beautiful and architecturally unique castle composed of many levels, each level with its own landing and garden. The castle spires, and there were many, resembled pointed witches' caps that pierced the sky majestically. Gaston had the run of this castle and the grounds surrounding it, and together with the prince of this kingdom, he spent his days exploring every inch of the castle and the kingdom's vast forests. Gaston and the prince had been the best of friends since they were first old enough to explore. Their mothers were very close and fancied the idea of their sons growing up together, and so they did. They were wild, adventurous, rough-and-tumble young boys, constantly seeking excitement, and they never had to look too hard to find it. The pair always found a way to create their own fun. They made games of finding the oldest trees and the most overgrown paths. They found abandoned outbuildings that were in disrepair and hollowed out oaks that led to underground tunnels, and they discovered an ancient and crumbling graveyard that seemed to have been there long before the prince's family ruled in this land. Some days they would spend hours riding their horses, jumping creeks and fences, daring each other to ride out as far as they could away from the prince's kingdom, so they could explore strange lands they had only learned about through stories and books they found in the castle library. And some days they would stay close to home, poring over those stories and dreaming of what their lives would be like when they were old enough to do whatever they liked. One of their favorite bits of mischief when in the castle was sneaking into the library to find all manner of books, including those on the history of the many kingdoms. These books were filled with lavish illustrations of beings that hadn't been seen in hundreds of years, like the great tree lords, who once ruled over all the lands that the many kingdoms were now built upon. Little did they know, not too long after, the tree lords would emerge again, awaking from their long slumber to take their place in the world once more. The castle librarian, Monsieur Bibliot, was a peevish and stuffy man who was rather particular about books never leaving the library, even though by rights the books belonged to the prince, or at least would belong to him one day. Monsieur Bibliot guarded the books like a greedy dragon protecting his treasure, sometimes even snarling and grumbling if he found that one was missing. Both the boys agreed Monsieur Bibliot looked more like a mole than a dragon. He was a squat man with a very round, bald head and small eyes that were magnified by his thick glasses. Gaston and the prince liked making a game of sneaking into the dragon's den, as they called it, daring each other to creep in while Monsieur Bibliot was attending to his duties. Sometimes the prince would go in under the pretense of asking Monsieur Bibliot a question, usually on a topic they knew the librarian was especially interested in and could talk about it at great length. The boys had observed Monsieur Bibliot was particularly intrigued by the history and construction of the various castles in the many kingdoms, and he was notably drawn to the diverse protocols in each of these castles' households. But his special interest, what occupied his time most, was learning about the keepers of books who came before him and how they ran their libraries. The average person, through no fault of their own, might not realize the royal librarian's province went well beyond the safekeeping of the royal tomes. The castle librarian was also the most knowledgeable about the house, its possessions, and those who have lived within its walls over the ages. They were also historians, so all the prince would have to do was ask Monsieur Bibliot a question about the house, or who was featured in a particular portrait, and Monsieur Bibliot would blather on about it endlessly. This would give Gaston the opportunity to sneak in and slip some books into his knapsack. Afterward, the boys would laugh, pleased they had outwitted stuffy old Monsieur Biblio again, and take their ill-gotten treasures to their treehouse, where they wouldn't be disturbed. Gaston and the prince loved almost nothing more than getting their hands on magnificent books filled with exciting tales of adventures. Gaston loved looking at the drawings while the prince read their histories aloud. They sometimes spent hours with one of Monsieur Biblio's precious tomes, tucked away in the treehouse Gaston's father had built for them, not far from the cottage where Gaston lived with his father. His father was the only grown-up who knew about their secret treehouse, as those who lived in the castle rarely visited the cottage, and he promised he would never tell. The hideaway was everything the boys could wish for, with its large round windows and a trap door they could close when they were inside. It was tucked high up in the strong branches of a massive and venerable oak, and at night the boys felt they were among the stars. They had cushions to sit upon, and stacks of the books from the library to enjoy, surrounded by the interesting things they found on their adventures. It was their secret place, a world where only the boys and their stories existed. "What book are you reading for us tonight? Is it about dragons?" asked Gaston, tossing their wooden swords and shields into a corner of the treehouse. They were dressed in their knight's outfits from their adventure earlier in the day. They had been running around the catacombs deep beneath the castle, searching for dragons. Of course, they didn't find any real dragons, but they had the grandest of times slaying the dragons in their imaginations. After a day of dragon slaying, they made themselves comfortable, lying back together on a mountain of cushions they had taken from this castle, and deciding to fall into the pages of one of their favorite books. Luckily, no one seemed to notice the various things that went missing from the castle that ended up in their treehouse, except that is for the books they spirited away from the library. "It's another story about the Deadwoods," said the prince, holding an old, thick book called the Book of Fairy Tales. "Those are my favorites. I hope there's a battle with all those dead soldiers." "There is. It's about Sir Jacob, remember him? This story is about his life before he died, and how he came to serve the queens of the dead." "Oh, wow. I always wondered how he ended up there." Gaston imagined what Sir Jacob must have looked like when he was alive. He hoped there would be a good description of him. Gaston loved the Book of Fairy Tales. It had everything he enjoyed most: exciting stories steeping in the history of the many kingdoms. And of course, it didn't hurt there were many tales involving dragons, gigantic talking trees, undead soldiers, witches, and magic. "Do you think we could go to the Dead Woods one day, Kingsley?" "Not unless you want to become one of Jacob's undead soldiers," said the prince with a laugh. "But we could go to Morningstar Kingdom. It's a long ride, but not so far we wouldn't be able to go there and back before dinner if we left early enough. Do you think our papas would let us?" "Let's not give them a chance to say no." Gaston loved this about his friend. The prince was always willing to go on an adventure, without a care for the rules. If he had been the sort of prince who followed the rules, they wouldn't be friends, and they wouldn't get to go on so many capers. They wouldn't have all the treasures they had collected on their many adventures. Some of their treasures were seemingly mundane, like interesting-looking pine cones, or brightly colored rocks, or acorns with strange symbols carved into them. They also had crow's feathers and broken pieces of headstones from the cemetery, and small bones they found on the forest floor. No matter how small, each treasure told a different story, a reminder of the adventure that they had that day. But their most valued treasure was the little hunting knife they used to cut the palms of their hands so they could become brothers. There wasn't anything magic in this, of course. Neither of them knew of such things, except from fairy stories the prince read aloud on occasion. They just wanted to be brothers, and this was the closest thing to being actual brothers they could think of. Being blood brothers. If it were up to Gaston and the prince, they would stay in their treehouse all day and well into the night if they could, poring poring over their most loved books and discussing the fantastic tales they discovered. And sometimes they would, until Gaston's father called up to them to remind the prince he was due home for dinner, or for his lessons with his tutor, Mr. Willowstick. Gaston would usually accompany the prince back to the castle, where they would part ways, the prince going to the dining hall and Gaston going to visit Mrs. Potts down in the kitchen or her sitting room. When dinner was over, they would both run off on another adventure, their pockets stuffed with goodies Mrs. Potts gave them. One of their other most loved pastimes was sneaking around parts of the castle that were forbidden. Telling either of them something wasn't allowed was like giving them a direct order to seek that thing out and discover its secrets. They spent countless hours wandering the catacombs under the castle and exploring its many secret passageways. They had even found hidden panels leading to passageways between the castle walls that took them directly to the kitchens in the basement, which weren't actually a secret at all, but rather well known to the staff, being a more direct passage for the servants, so they might bring meals to the dining hall and attend to their other duties without disturbing the royal family. But the boys had invented other reasons for these secret passageways. Without tales that fueled their imaginations, giving them endless hours of fun, they both loved hiding behind the secret doors and popping out when they heard someone on the other side to give the unlucky passerby a fright, though taking special care not to do this to Mr. Cogsworth. Neither of the boys wanted to give Mr. Cogsworth a reason to be cross with them, or more precisely, even more reasons to be cross with Gaston, because Mr. Cogsworth seemed to always be in a state of disapproval where Gaston was concerned. This wasn't so with the head housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, or the majority of the other servants. They all seemed to love Gaston and were happy to let the boys have their fun, even letting Gaston and the prince believe they had made a new discovery when they'd pop into the kitchen unexpectedly, pretending to be ghouls and then begging for treats, which Mrs. Potts always had on hand when the boys came bounding into her sitting room or kitchens. Almost all the servants treated Gaston and the prince like they were brothers. Not that they were brothers, mind you, but they were around the same age, and being such good friends, they were always in each other's company, and they had declared they were blood brothers after all, and who was to tell them otherwise? Gaston's father, Grosvenor, was the king's groundskeeper and royal huntsman. It was his job to oversee the grooms who cared for the horses and the dogs, and to supervise those who cared for the grounds and forests that surrounded the castle. But most importantly, he arranged the royal hunts for the king and his various royal guests. And though Gaston had the run of the castle upstairs and down, in the evenings he would go home to the same cottage he lived in on the grounds with his father, away from the bustle of the castle, just as his father preferred. Grosvenor hadn't always been content to be tucked away in his cottage. He used to be very social with the other staff, but these days he preferred his own company to anyone else's. That is, except for Gaston, whom he loved heartily. Gaston loved his father too, but life with him could get lonely in their cottage in the woods. Grosvenor was a good man who took pride in his work and made it his business to pass his craft on to his son. He was a kind and loving father, but Gaston sensed there was a deep wound within his father's heart, a secret wound his father protected that sometimes caused him great melancholy. Grosvenor would sit for hours outside their cottage and just gaze at the starlit sky. Gaston was always welcome to join his father in the chair right next to his, and they would on occasion sit together in silence, watching the stars blink against the dark curtain of night. Gaston knew who haunted his father's thoughts: his mother. Gaston's mother, Rose, died when he was very young. He had no real memories of her, just the stories the servants and his father told him, and it seemed she had been loved by everyone who knew her. And though she had been very friendly with the other servants, she had been particularly close with Mrs. Potts. The two had become fast friends when they came to work in the castle as young parlor maids. Together they rose in the ranks, Mrs. Potts becoming head housekeeper, and Rose becoming lady's maid and companion to the Queen. The two ladies were always in each other's company when they weren't attending to their duties, and stood for each other when they eventually got married. In those days, Grosvenor and Rose would take their meals in the big house, which is what they called the castle, with the other servants, and together they shared the stories of their days, laughing and sometimes staying up all hours enjoying each other's company. And so it was, until Rose died. According to Mrs. Potts, no one had an unkind word for Rose, and everyone in the house, upstairs and down, was heartbroken when she died. The Queen was said to be in a tragic state of grief when Rose was taken from them so unexpectedly, and insisted Rose be buried on the estate so the Queen might visit her friend's resting place, often bringing flowers to her grave with her own hands. No one would tell Gaston how his mother died, and he knew it was tragic because it was always talked about in hushed tones, with stricken facial expressions. But the one thing Gaston was almost sure of, his father's face bore the scars from whatever happened that night, and he knew they were nothing compared to the scars on his father's heart. So Gaston understood why his father sometimes wouldn't speak for hours, and why he liked the isolation of his little stone cottage in the woods. With Gaston's mother gone, the other grown-ups in his life rallied around him. Though Gaston's father's responsibilities to the crown were great, and he often slipped into silent melancholia without warning, he would always make time for Gaston, taking special care to show his son everything he would need to know so that one day Gaston could take his place as the royal huntsman. It was a good position, especially for someone who loved to be out of doors, hunting and adventuring. And though Gaston shared that love with his father and respected him in his position, Gaston wanted more. He wanted to learn to read and to write, and he wanted to learn about the world and its stories. He wanted the same education the prince received. He was happy when the prince read him stories, but he wanted to read them for himself. When he shared this with his friend, the prince insisted Gaston sit with him in the lessons, but his tutor, Mr. Willowstick, refused, saying Gaston would only be a distraction. And when Gaston asked his father if he could attend the village school, his father said he saw no reason, since Gaston had so much to learn to become the royal huntsman. Eventually, Gaston gave up asking his father if he could attend school, and learned what he could from the books he and the prince enjoyed together. But it always made him feel like he was missing something, and it was yet another example of how he wasn't truly the prince's equal, no matter how the prince insisted he was. Since Rose's death, Mrs. Potts had taken a special interest in Gaston. Mrs. Potts adored him, and was always there to offer advice or a scolding wag of her finger, depending on the situation. Gaston was welcome to pop into Mrs. Potts' sitting room, where she spent much of her time completing her various duties. When she wasn't in her sitting room, she was overseeing the kitchen staff and the maids, or keeping Chef Bouge company while doing a little baking of her own, which was one of her cherished pastimes. Mr. Cogsworth, who was rather stuffier, didn't approve of Gaston having the run of the castle. More times than not, if he was tutting or grumbling, it was about Gaston, especially when he and the prince would run into the castle after one of their adventures with muddy boots. Cogsworth never missed an opportunity to remind Gaston he shouldn't enter through the front door, but rather around back where the servants enter the castle. The prince would always wave Mr. Cogsworth off, saying that sort of thing didn't matter, but it was Cogsworth's job, after all, to keep up the standards of the house, and one of those standards was making sure Gaston knew his place. Or at least, that was how Mr. Cogsworth saw it. Gaston was a servant's son, after all, and servants entered the castle around back. And though the king and queen didn't seem to mind their son's friendship with the Gaston, Mr. Cogsworth made it clear he felt it was a friendship that could not endure into adulthood. There were stories, of course, of aristocrats and their servants crossing the Great Divide and becoming true friends, but they were rare. And even though there had already been such a miraculous friendship in their own household between the Queen and Gaston's mother, Rose, Mr. Cogsworth still frowned upon such things. When Rose was still alive, the Queen insisted after Gaston's birth that he would be cared for in the castle nursery during the day, rather than Rose finding someone from the village to watch him while she attended to her other duties. The Queen herself was expecting a child of her own soon, and the two women loved the idea of their children growing up together. Mr. Cogsworth didn't approve of any of this, of course. He was a fan of the old ways, you see, and wasn't what one would call a modernist, but there was little he could say when it was what the Queen desired. Mr. Cogsworth's rather stodgy ways inspired many discussions over the years between him and Mrs. Potts, rather loud discussions, which would often send the other servants scattering in every direction, especially when Mrs. Potts started throwing teacups in frustration. On one particular day, when the boys were both around 7 years old, Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts had driven everyone out of the castle with one of their arguments. She had been in the kitchen going over the menu with Chef Bouge while doing a little baking of her own when Mr. Cogsworth came stomping and grumbling into the kitchen. Mrs. Potts spent most of her time in the kitchen when she wasn't in her sitting room tending to her other duties. She liked the company of Chef Bouge and the kitchen maids, and the hustle of the footmen running in and out and cracking their jokes. She even enjoyed when Mr. Cogsworth would come in for a little chat or cup of tea, but she could tell by the look on his face that day the major domo wasn't in good spirits. "I don't know how many times I've had to tell that boy Gaston to go through the servants' entrance. You should see the mud he tracked into the vestibule, as if we all didn't have enough work preparing for the King and Queen's return from their travels." Mr. Cogsworth's mustache was twitching with frustration, and Mrs. Potts shook her head and sighed while she continued making her cookies. Strictly speaking, baking was not one of Mrs. Potts' duties. She was the head housekeeper. She was second in command to Mr. Cogsworth, but it was more of a partnership, or at least that was how she saw it. The fact was, she enjoyed baking, and rather than adding to Chef Bouge's duties by asking him to bake extra treats for the prince, Gaston, and her own children, of which she had many, she did it herself, because she loved almost nothing more than indulging children. "And I suppose the prince didn't track in any of this mud?" Mrs. Potts brushed away a strand of hair that had managed to make its way from under her cap as she stamped dough with a large cookie cutter in the shape of a pirate ship, raising an eyebrow at Mr. Cogsworth. "He's the prince. He can track whatever he wants, wherever he wants. Gaston is the son of a servant." Cogsworth always took this stance. In his eyes, the prince could never do wrong. Gaston, on the other hand, was another story. "Why do you always have to put the poor lad in his place like that, Mr. Cogsworth? Have one of the cookies I baked for the boys. Perhaps that will make you less grumpy," she said, grinning at him. "It's refreshing to hear you think Gaston has a place at all, Mrs. Potts. You treat those boys like they are brothers. You're not doing Gaston any favors, you realize, treating him like he's the prince's equal. They love each other like brothers, Mr. Cogsworth, and why shouldn't they? You couldn't pry those boys apart if you tried." "Don't I know it? And how do you think that will go when they're both grown and Gaston is the groundskeeper here?" said Mr. Cogsworth. Mrs. Potts supposed he might have been right in different circumstances with different boys, but she knew them better than Mr. Cogsworth did. She knew their hearts. "Gaston will be the royal huntsman, Mr. Cogsworth, and the King and Queen don't seem to mind their friendship, so I don't see why you should. The King and Queen are too busy to notice." The comment took Mrs. Potts by surprise. That kind of thing was never spoken out loud, even if from the servant's perspective it did seem to be the case. The king and queen were often away, and when they were at the castle, they were too busy to spend time with their son. But Mrs. Potts knew the queen loved her son and took a special interest in Gaston, and was pleased the two of them were friends. Well, I say leave it alone, Mr. Cogsworth. Just let them be. Think about how lonely the prince would be without Gaston. Think of the trouble he would get into without Gaston's friendship, especially with the likes of you telling him he can do and say what he pleases. So what if they remain friends when they grow up? What harm will it do? You know how close the queen was to Gaston's mother. She loved her like a sister. No matter how well the queen loved Rose, she was still the queen's servant, and Rose knew her place. Even I, the major domo of this great and respected house, know my place, and as such, it's up to me to keep a watchful eye on the prince, he said with hands on hips, blustering and posturing. Mrs. Potts knew when Mr. Cogsworth put his hands on his hips, he was staunchly ensconced in stubbornness. There was no shaking his resolve. Well, you keep your eye on him your way, and I will do the same in mine, she said, handing a baking sheet covered with pirate-shaped cookies to one of the kitchen maids to take to the oven. By passing them sweets and treating them both like little princes, no doubt, Mr. Cogsworth grumbled. So what if I do? Now off with you. You'd better get upstairs and make sure all is ready for the king and queen's return. I have enough on my plate managing their welcome home feast with Chef Bouge without you coming in here and scaring everyone out of the kitchen. Mrs. Potts could hear her voice rising like a tea kettle about to boil. And it was no wonder, with Mr. Cogsworth prattling on and being, in her opinion, a considerable snob. Well then, if you see the prince, you do tell them I expect him downstairs to greet his parents when they arrive, without Gaston in tow. Tick-tock, Mr. Cogsworth. The king and queen will be here before you know it, said Mrs. Potts, pointing to the clock. With a twitch of his mustache, Mr. Cogsworth turned on his heel and left the kitchen. Like a general at war, he looked on his way to secure the battlements when he was gone. Mrs. Potts could hear the sounds of giggling and shuffling feet from behind the hidden panel that led to the passageway connecting the kitchen to the dining room. She wondered how much of the conversation they had heard. You can come out now, boys. He's gone, she said, smiling at them as they came out from behind the hidden wall panel. I suppose you heard everything he said? Well, for the record, I love you both the same. Don't listen to Stuffy owed Mr. Cogsworth. Don't give him a second thought. Do you understand? She glanced at Gaston, who seemed a little sad. It broke her heart to see him disheartened, and she always did her best to bring him out of such moods. It was a promise she made herself when Gaston's mother died, that she would look after him like he was one of her own. I wouldn't mind if Gaston were my brother, said the prince, beaming and proud as he stood next to his friend. What a pair they made, both covered in mud from their adventures, each of them so devoted to the other. I know you wouldn't mind, my dear. You're a sweet boy, Mrs. Potts said, smiling at the prince. And I suppose you were playing nights in the woods, killing some creature or another, perhaps a mud monster? Everyone knows there's no such thing as mud monsters, Mrs. Potts. No, we were hunting dragons in the... Gaston, shh, said the prince, elbowing him in the ribs. Don't give away all our secrets. The prince often made Mrs. Potts laugh. The idea that they could keep anything from her was comical. You don't think I know everything you boys get up to? Never mind. You heard Mr. Cogsworth. Get yourselves upstairs and ready to greet your parents. I won't have you covered in mud when they arrive. Here. She handed them each a cookie topped with a dollop of something ill-favored that looked like it might be frosting. What's this gray stuff? Asked Gaston, eyeing the cookie and sniffing it suspiciously. Try it, dear. It's just crumbled cookies mixed in with pudding and cream. I promise it's delicious, she said, piling more frosting into pudding bowls in anticipation of them wanting more. The prince munched his cookie, seeming to agree with Mrs. Potts's description, and happily took the bowl Mrs. Potts offered him. Come on, Gaston, have some. It really is delicious. The prince scooped the dollop of gray stuff out of the bowl with his finger and nudged Gaston with his elbow. And then we could go back to our tree house, he added, smiling. I'm going to keep Gaston here with me for a spot of tea, dear. You go now and get ready for your parents' arrival. Mrs. Potts, who, unlike Mr. Cogsworth, never stood on ceremony, didn't bother to call the prince by his royal title. The prince didn't seem to mind, but he did look grumpy that Mrs. Potts didn't let him get away with sneaking off with Gaston to their tree house rather than making himself presentable for his parents. Here, take these, she said, giving him a pile of cookies wrapped in cloth and a kiss on the cheek to take with him. After the prince slipped out of the room, Mrs. Potts put her hand on Gaston's. It was clear something was bothering him. What's wrong, dear? I wish we were brothers, he said with a big sigh. You are brothers in your heart, dear, and that means even more than sharing parents, she said, nudging his chin gently with her hand so his eyes would meet hers. But what if Mr. Cogsworth is right? What if the prince doesn't want to be my friend when we're older? I know in my heart he will, dear. I promise you. Come on, cheer up. I sent a message to your father saying you two are to join us in the servants' hall for dinner this evening, she said, noticing Chef Bouge walking toward them. Really? Is that allowed? Asked Gaston. Of course it's allowed, my boy, said Chef Bouge. We will have a magnificent feast to celebrate. It's been far too many years since your father joined us for dinner. He patted Gaston on the shoulder. But won't Cogsworth mind? Gaston asked. You leave Mr. Cogsworth to me, dear, Mrs. Potts replied. Dinner won't be until late this evening after we've served upstairs dinner. Here, she handed him a plate of sandwiches. Have these with your tea before you go. I won't have you going hungry waiting so long before dinner. Thank you, Mrs. Potts, Gaston said, wondering what he had done to deserve such luck. After his tea and sandwiches, Gaston went through the passageway between the walls of the castle. He imagined he would find the prince there waiting for him, deciding he would skip greeting his parents. Gaston had even put some of the sandwiches aside should his friend want something to eat before being made to eat the fancy food they served in the dining room. To Gaston's disappointment, the prince wasn't waiting for him in the passageway, but he reasoned his friend had actually done what he was told and was now getting ready for his parents' homecoming. So Gaston finished all the sandwiches himself as he made his way through the passageway. He wished the prince was with him. They loved these secret places and knew them all by heart. He chose the path leading to a tunnel, taking him down to the grounds without having to cross the bridge. He made his way through the forest, which was rather beautiful that time of the day. It was the moment when night and day met, turning the sky orange and making the trees and buildings look like black paper cutouts. The cemetery looked like the pages of a pop-up book he remembered from when he and the prince were young children together in the day nursery. It didn't seem real, with its tombstones, mausoleums, and gnarled trees silhouetted against the too perfect sky. It didn't seem real that this was where his mother was laid to rest. His mother was nothing more than stories to him, like a character in a book, or one of the fairy tales the prince read to him. He supposed he loved her, as much as anyone could love someone they didn't know, but he wished more than anything that he had known her, not only for his sake, but for his father's, because Gaston knew his father loved and missed her with all his heart, as he stood there watching day turn into night, looking at the changes of light and shadows of the tree branches stretch across the cemetery. He wondered how life would have been if his mother had lived, or what it would have been like if he and the prince were truly brothers. He thought about this as he continued walking home through the forest. He knew well until he finally arrived at the stone cottage where he lived with his father. It was a nice cottage, really, larger than most cottages on the estate. His father had said they were given such a grand quarters because of how well loved his mother was before her passing. But it seemed to Gaston, even at such a young age, that his father never truly saw his own worth. Even though his father was the best at everything, he was the best hunter, stalker, and tracker. He knew the names of all the trees, flowers, and bushes. He knew which plants, mushrooms, and berries were poisonous, and which could be eaten, and he knew the names of all the creatures, including the different species of birds that resided in the vast forest of which he was the caretaker. And he knew how to care for sick animals, for which Gaston felt a particular pride because he was in awe of his father's extensive knowledge and experience when it came to animal care. He had even been known to bring home a wounded creature on occasion, nursing it back to health, or staying up all night with the grooms caring for a sick and injured horse or dog. Gaston thought that his father was a great man, but he didn't think his father had a sense of his own greatness. He didn't realize he was the best. But then again, if he had, he wouldn't be the same person. And Gaston loved his father just the way he was. When Gaston got to the cottage, he saw smoke billowing from the stone chimney. His father was probably sitting by the fire, already comfortable in his favorite chair. Gaston had been hoping he would get there before his father, so he wouldn't have had time to settle in for the night. His father worked hard, and when he came home he was happy to be there, happy to just sit by the fire and relax. Gaston wondered how happy he would be to learn he was making a trip to the castle this evening. "So I hear we're having dinner in the big house tonight. Is this your doing? Did you wrangle an invitation from Mrs. Potts?" said his father when Gaston walked into their cottage. As Gaston suspected, his father was already sitting next to the large stone fireplace in his favorite wooden chair, his hand dangling down to absent-mindedly pet their tortoise-shell cat, who was resting on her cushion next to Gaston's father. "No, Papa. She just told me about it," said Gaston, noticing the cat slowly blinking her large yellow eyes at him. "I see you've come back home," he said, kneeling down to giving her chin a scratch. "What have you been up to while away so long, I wonder? Oh, you know how she is. She's like you, Gaston, always off on her adventures. And just like you, I never worry she won't come home, no matter how long she's away," Gaston's father said with a smile. "Now, I suppose we both have to bathe and dress properly for this grand event?" "It's not an event, Papa. It's just dinner with the inside staff," said Gaston, hoping his father wouldn't grumble his way into refusing Mrs. Potts' invitation. "I'd rather eat dinner in my own home, Gaston. I'm comfortable here. But I suppose it's lonely just having the company of your old papa every evening." "I wouldn't say that. Perhaps not to me, but I'm guessing you said it so to Mrs. Potts." "It won't be so bad, will it, Papa? I hear you used to eat dinner in the big house all the time when Mama was alive, and I know you like Mr. and Mrs. Potts." "That I do, son." "All right, then. Who am I kidding anyway? There is no way I am going to turn down Mrs. Potts' invitation. She would blow her top." He laughed his deep, warm laugh. "And I suppose you and the prince were in the kitchens today. Mrs. Potts had enough on her hands with all her work and her own children running underfoot, without you and the prince pestering her for treats. She doesn't mind. I don't believe she does. She's always had a big heart, that Mrs. Potts." "Well, we'd better smarten ourselves up, then, shouldn't we? And we mustn't be late for dinner. We don't want to give old Mr. Cogsworth a reason to twitch his mustache at us now, do we?" Grosvenor said, making Gaston laugh. "You're right. I've already had enough mustache twitching for one day."